Hey y'all, it's Joefer here, the cranky old gay guy. Today we're going to be touching on a touching topic. This is not a happy day. Um, I guess it is for some because well, we'll get into it. Today is Transgender Day of Remembrance, Thursday, November 20th. Now, I don't want to shout out happy, but today memorializes those who have been lost transgender in the transgender community. Um, Now you can be happy because you're celebrating their lives, but you are also mournful because they've passed. So I interact with the trans community usually every week. And when I say trans community, I mean members of the trans community because I play pool and they play pool as well. And I see them when I go out and we chat. Um, I read a bunch of stats this morning because I looked up Trans Remembrance Day and I wanted to know how many trans people have been lost. I also listen to gay programming on podcasts, and I hear every week they talk about trans women who've been um, unlived in violent interactions. So I know it happens. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to read something. Some of this is from an organization, the organization that actually started Trans Remembrance Day. And then at the end, I got a little bit of stats from the HRC, which is the Human Rights Campaign. So my eyes are going to come off the camera and they're going to go down to the screen because I'm going to read this to you. Transgender Day of Remembrance, Thursday, November 20th. First held in 1999, Transgender Day of Remembrance was initially intended to mourn those transgender people lost to violence. The first organizers memorialized Rita Hester, killed in November of 98 in Boston, and Chanelle Pickett, murdered in November 1995 in Watertown, Massachusetts. Since that time, the Transgender Day of Remembrance has expanded to mourn the loss and to celebrate the lives of those who have passed. For stats from Advocates for Trans Equality, it's a national organization, there are a minimum of 58 known transgender people who have died in the United States over the past year, whether due to murder, suicide, or natural causes. In many cases, activists call for greater legal protections for transgender people or demand accountability for police and news media who regularly interact with or report on the deaths of transgender people. Boy, I don't know what's going on today. Transgender people who are often misidentified or misgendered in death. Here's a quote from Bahari Thomas, Director of Public Education at Advocates for Trans Equality. They said, right-wing extremists are endangering our democracy and our very right to exist. Thomas continued, trans people, especially Black trans women, continue to bear the brunt of discriminatory policies, political scapegoating, and violence. These forces are interconnected and deadly. Trans people deserve more than remembrance. We deserve the chance to live full, joyful, and self-determined lives. As anti-transgender violence often goes unreported, or victims are not necessarily identified as transgender by police or the media, many activists posit that the number of transgender people who have died is much larger than reported. And I would say that's probably the case because that's the way it is in a lot of communities. It's just underreported in general. This year's report memorializes 27 U.S. individuals killed by violence, 21 who committed suicide, and 8 who passed away from natural causes. The cause of death is unknown for 2 individuals listed on the report, one transgender man and the other non-binary. Of the 27 deaths attributed to violence, more than 3/4 of the victims were transgender women, while 11% were transgender men, and another 11% were non-binary. 63% of those in the report were Black, 26% were white, and 26%, and 11% were Latino or Latina. These statistics align with post-analysis finding that Black transgender women are the most likely to become victims of anti-trans violence. Among those who committed suicide, 2/3 were transgender women, 19% non-binary, and 14% transgender men. Suicide was much more prevalent among white individuals. Many who lost their lives to suicide skewed significantly younger, while 62% of victims were younger than 24. This report is not just a record of loss, it's a call to action, Thomas said. Every name represents a life that mattered. They were artists, dancers, writers, computer scientists, students, parents, friends, and much more. The work to end anti-trans violence begins with honoring the truth. And that's the truth of who these people were. They were trans Americans. And trans people deserve to be seen in their full humanity and live long, safe, and authentic lives. Now, per the HRC, that's the Human Rights Campaign, they put out a little report today too. And here's a stat I pulled from it. In almost 400 cases of fatal violence against transgender people tracked since 2013, 70% were against Black people. Nearly 60 were Black trans women. That's 60% were Black trans women. And 71% of cases involved gun violence. Now, the gun violence thing came up in a lot of the things I read this morning on different sites. That seems to be the method that's used most often to unalive someone. Oftentimes, these trans women were attacked on the street, or they were followed home and not only murdered, but taken at SA'd prior to their deaths. There were a handful I read that they were actually, the main suspect is that person's romantic lover, who for unknown reasons ends up unaliving them. And that could be, I can't surmise. Each case is different, but those who've been convicted, some were afraid that they were going to be outed, that people would find out that they're with a trans person. Others, it was just violence and dominance. And others were ones they became romantically involved with, who had set out from the beginning just to draw them in so they could hurt them. And they end up, taking their lives. I did read another report this morning, and I want to say there's a statement from Tina Kotek here in Oregon, and she put up little profiles of 50 of these transgender people who have been killed in the last year. And all of them, well, all but one or two on the list were trans women, and the majority of them were women of color. I saw 2 Caucasians as I scrolled. I was going to start reading these things as a part of the video, but they were just too many, and each one had like an obit about their life. It was pretty sad, and like I said, most of them were women of color. There was one transgender man, or maybe 2, one trans man and one non-binary person on the list, and the rest were all people who were going places and doing things, and now they're not. So on this day of Transgender Remembrance, mourn the loss of what these people could have contributed to society, while at the same time celebrating their lives and the good things that they did while they were here. All right, that is it for today. I will see you again tomorrow. I'm not going to give my sign off today because it doesn't seem appropriate since this is a mournful occasion. All right, everyone, I will see you tomorrow. If you care to take part in a Transgender Remembrance celebration in your community or online, and I will see you all tomorrow. Bye-bye.